Awesome. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the future of EOA and AA Breakout call number 2. We've got a pretty big agenda, and we made this call 90 minutes instead of the usual 60 minutes for breakouts. It takes a lot to get everybody here from the community, and I want to be respectful of that organization. I also think it's prudent for me to not moderate this call since I'm been pretty involved in discussions and my take is obviously not biased in the debate. So I have found a few people to help us moderate this discussion. I think they're people that you have seen in the AA community over the last few years. So with that said, I would like to turn over this moderation to Nico and Eric.
Thanks, Light Client. So indeed, we will be moderating today. We have a lot of things to go through. So I think we can get started. Eric, what do you think?
I hope 90 minutes will be enough to cover for everything, but we'll do our best.
All right, let's go. So we have the updated agenda. We will go for the first point, which is account migration in the protocol AA roadmap. So if everyone can prepare their take and give something in the chat. If you have prepared your messages that you wanted to pass, we asked people to prepare. And if not, we can go straight to the account migration point.
I think maybe if I can add some context, since I wrote this agenda and I had some things in mind as I was writing it, and then we can have a bit of discussion about it, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I think one reason that, there's a lot of reasons to have this call to talk about 3074 and the proposals, but the reason I wanted to talk about this AA roadmap before we talked about the proposals is I don't think that there's full alignment on what or when this full native account abstraction roadmap looks like for layer 1. And I wanted to hear from people working on native account abstraction, people building smart accounts, and like what the expectations there are, just to try and move into the next discussion about like what is there to do today with more clarity about where are we all moving towards. I can share my perspective from being a client developer on layer 1 that it's not clear to me what or when the native account abstraction roadmap will occur. Based on where things are today, it doesn't feel like it is on the forefront of client developers' minds how to ship native account abstraction. So that is usually a good indication that we are at least 1 or 2 years away from possibly scheduling such a feature into a fork. So if that is kind of the lower bound for how soon we can have these types of features, it to me feels very prudent to ship something in the Pectra fork that improves the situation for EOAs.
Ugh.
That's what I have to say. I'm curious what others think about this.
There's a.
Oh. All right, thanks. Richard, I see you have raised your hand. You can take the mic.
Sure, thanks. Just to take up the microphone from Matt, right? Like, I think for me, we all have been working, especially the smart account teams have been working on wanting to have more native supports for smart accounts for a long time. And it's always this, I wouldn't say battle, it's maybe a strong word, but if there are discussions around this with some of the node teams or the client teams, right, like they are very defensive about it for good reasons. I'm not going to judge this, but obviously now for us, it's always about, okay, we want to have native account abstraction. We've seen this in other ecosystems work to some extent. We see that 4327 set a very nice starting point where we can iterate on. And these were signs for a lot of the smart accounts that we go towards native account abstraction. And in my opinion, I would have loved to see this even faster, but I think we all agree since it has been a while. And now the question is, okay, why I agree with you that the signs, because the client teams are still very defensive. If you hear comments like the guest team being very conservative about not wanting to implement 7560, might have changed, but because of complexity. These are obviously signs that dampen a little bit like, okay, how can we go there? Even so, I would really want to have some, or like as one of the smart account based teams, would love to have some commitments that we, or like some clarity. Do we want to stick on, we want to make smart accounts first class citizens and that this should be our go-to solution, or do we rather want to go the route of empowering EOAs, which for you from the UX perspective is a valid road, right? Like I'm not gonna challenge on this one, but it's a very different one, at least right now, compared to what we started with for 3.7. Personally, for me, I would still see that having like in my mind, and I think Yoav can give this more realistic numbers actually, but I would have seen that in the next 1 to 2 years, we get RIP 7560, so the basically native account abstraction on rollups, to a state that we have enough insights that actually after Pectra, so after the Worker fork, we can really start tackling this on mainnet. And with this, then transitioning over the wider ecosystem, or like enabling the wider Ethereum-based ecosystem of having native account abstraction support, and then starting actually after this to migrate accounts over towards smart accounts, because then if we have native smart accounts are first-class citizens, then the migration should also not be that painful anymore. This was my understanding for the like basically what would be coming after Worker, the Merkle fork. But yeah, this is again being slightly challenged with 3074 timeline-wise. That's I think also where some of the controversy comes from. Oh yeah, sorry.
Thanks.
Yeah, sorry, let's land. But like, I'm not meaning that after Pectra we see anything native account abstraction. It was after the Worker, right? Like we have Pectra and Worker, and then I would have seen native account abstraction. Sorry,
Right.
this.
That makes sense.
I think Ansgar wanted to give some comments.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly comment specifically on the kind of the situation specifically regarding enshrined account abstraction and the difference in between layer 1 and layer 1 and layer 2. Basically, I think some of the problem that 437 ran into is that on the layer 2 side, there's a lot of interest in also short term already enshrining some version of account abstraction. And so that's how kind of IP 7560 came into being. But IP 7560 is the very first kind of large IP. And so we are for the first time kind of actually figuring out how could layer 2s move beyond pure EVM equivalence. So basically adding features that layer 1 does not yet have, the layer 1 EVM. And in particular, one problem that so far we're still kind of looking into how to do this is basically that layer 2s mostly just use largely unmodified layer 1 clients. Well, in practice, they mostly use Geth. But which means that even before we want to ship this to mainnet, we would basically need to have some sort of support for this native account abstraction in Geth. That doesn't, of course, have to be done by the Geth team itself. There could be some, like the layer 2 teams, but layer 2 teams are very hesitant to basically make large modifications on their own that they have to basically maintain. The Geth team has been very hesitant to basically implement and maintain large features that are not relevant for layer 1. So we are in a little bit of an impasse there right now, but we have to solve this anyway because there are multiple directions in which layer 2s might want to move beyond layer 1, right? So there are a lot of thoughts there, but this will take some time to sort out. And so right now, kind of native account abstraction on layer 2s is somewhat blocked by basically this having to be figured out first. And then on the layer 1 side, I will say that part of the reason for why, because otherwise we could just wait for layer 1 to start moving in the direction, but it does seem like on layer 1 side, we are much more conservative, right, with these bigger changes. So I think the realistic time until we are very confident that we have a good solution there might still be a bit longer. There's, for example, now one good step in that direction is there's been this recent EIP to basically take the IP 7560, but remove the enshrined Solidity interface by instead using EOF, which is a good direction, but it will still take some time. So I don't think, even after Worker, I think it's very optimistic. I would say there's probably at least 3, 4, 5 years before mainnet moves to native account abstraction. And we are still in the process of figuring out how can layer 2s do this faster.
Thanks. Very interesting point. I guess we will need to talk about it more during the roll call and dedicated layer 2 calls. Anyone else with a take right now? All right. I guess we can jump into the agenda then, if that sounds good for you guys. So should we directly go to EIP 3074? As I think a lot of questions will revolve around this, and we have some new proposal from Vitalik. So I guess a lot of people would want to talk about this. So maybe we can directly go to this, or maybe Matt, do you want to give us insight on the different previous points?
Yeah, I'm trying to make a platform for people who disagree with some of the decisions that were made with all core devs, because we've sort of accepted 3074 to go into the next fork, and what does that mean? That just means that the core devs are putting these into the dev nets that they're working on right now. We have the opportunity to change 3074 some. We have the opportunity to potentially send a different proposal through and accept it and remove 3074. These aren't necessarily set in stone. It's just moving a step of confidence higher that this is the direction that we're trying to go. And the feedback was a lot of people felt that that was not the right decision. It didn't work with what they believed account abstraction was supposed to look on, like on Ethereum. And I wanted to give people the opportunity to discuss how Ethereum should be changing over the next 1 year to improve the situation currently with EOAs, but also support the account abstraction roadmap. And there's some points here, is account migration the thing that we should be prioritizing over something like 3074? That was a discussion that we had in February, and it seemed like 3074 won, but I understand that there are people who weren't part of that discussion back in February. So I wanted to maybe give them a chance to talk about that. And then the smart contract originated transactions we sort of just talked about. It seems that we're several years away minimum from having that on L1. So maybe we can skip over that and then, maybe dive into 3074.
All right. So I think we've had many different takes on what was wrong with 3074 in the AA group. So if someone that was supporting one of those takes want to speak now, I think it's a good time. Obviously, nothing is set in stone, so we can be chill, and it's the moment to speak, guys.
Hey, maybe we can chat briefly about some of the comments going on in the nav bar, but my biggest question right now is around inclusion of 3074 and L1 today, especially given that it comes at the cost of some features that better support rollups like censorship resistance fee inclusion lists, and is generally incongruent with the overall rollup centric roadmap. I think there's a great opportunity for us to define what is an Ethereum score charter right now and how to best support that versus what are in rollup score charters. And even as an RIP, I think this would have been less controversial, but even then I think it fits a little bit less cleanly in what has been the well-defined long-term AA roadmap. So I still struggle to see how this fits into the long-term system in a way that promotes the right incentives for users on using the right systems and how to grow these things in the long term.
I can quickly talk about inclusion list. I don't think that inclusion of 3074 has anything to do with excluding inclusion lists from Prague. Basically, we worked on inclusion lists quite a bit and kind of found several issues with inclusion lists that weren't great. And it felt like we were just patching up bugs that we found, and the spec was never really finished. It kept evolving. And yes, one of the arguments for not including inclusion lists is that it doesn't play well with 3074, but that wasn't the only argument to not include inclusion lists. So I don't think that it's either inclusion lists or 3074. Inclusion lists were not included because they were not done as a feature on their own.
But doesn't this kind of shut the door on adding them in future hard forks too? At least as
Any
defined
kind
today.
of account abstraction where one account can spend the funds of another account or can modify anything of another account is something that doesn't play well with inclusion lists.
Yeah,
basically.
but
And so like we can yeah, we can find a way to make inclusion lists work with any of with all of the features, or we can just say, yeah, we're not going to ship any feature that is looking like account abstraction. Or
yeah, but then it
this
becomes a
framework.
question of like sequencing and priorities, right? And like, what is the core focus of L1 Ethereum, and like on what invariants should it best support its customers? And from my perspective, its customers are increasingly rollups more than end users, and that's why I'm flagging this as something that I see as incongruent.
I just don't see 3074 or something similar to 3074 being a big detractor from L1 moving in the direction that we're talking about. Like if we were saying, okay, 3074 is going to be this 2-year project, it's going to take all of the teams, the same level of work that it's taking to merge the Verkle, then that would be a big question about like what is our direction. But we're talking about like an EIP that takes 2 hours for a client to implement. It feels like a big win for the users on Ethereum today, and it seems like something that we can just do without significantly detracting from the direction that we're moving.
I think yeah, sorry.
Richard? Yeah, go ahead.
yes.
You were muted.
Yeah. I generally agree that I think on the node side, this is not like there's implementation of Ford. It's probably not the biggest blocker. I think also when I was primarily voicing my skepticism here was less about actually the node teams and more on the level of the accounts, wallets, and the dApps, right? Like while there are definitely synergies where 3074 will in general break some of the stalemate with dApps most likely when it comes to that we should not just assume certain execution flows as we have them right now, which is a big item that we need to work on. I think also on some other fronts that we create some duality again between two standards, which might or might not be, to be honest, create a delay or not. I don't know. Might also speed up things. Who knows? This is where my personal skepticism came from when it came to, okay, should we now go for a second option or should we try to stick to 4337 for the time being? I get all the reasons, and my point that I wanted to make is we should not only think what does it mean in overhead towards the node teams, it also means towards dApps, wallets, alignment on the wallet side. And there are different reasons. It's not as black and white as I think we have had a lot of discussions, but this is where my personal skepticism came from. I'm still would not be, I mean, there are different views on this.
Yeah, I don't know. For me, I don't see it as a separate track. I feel like it's something that we can put into 4337 and help supercharge the adoption of 4337 because there are still a lot of EOAs out there, and integrating, like allowing EOAs to use 4337, increasing the base functionality of the account that dApps can expect. I think it will proliferate the adoption of a lot of these standards much faster than if we're just waiting for everyone to migrate or upgrade to smart contract wallets.
All right, I see some hands raised. Ansgar and Rafi, you can take the mic and then we can move forward.
Yeah, just briefly just briefly on the point of basically 437 compatibility with 3074. I do think that a lot of the concerns here, or like the concerns around 3074, do come from this question of will we end up with two competing tech stacks? And the thing is that yes, 3074 can be made fully compatible, and like if all the invokers that end up being used are invokers that actually allow for 437 style kind of decentralized mempool flow, then I think a lot of people's concerns would be eased. The question is, it's not clear that we can basically ensure this from the outset. Like, it's not clear that we can put guardrails in advance to make sure that the invokers that end up most heavily used do these things. There have been some ideas, like, for example, we could even initially launch 3074 on mainnet with a whitelist, in protocol whitelist of invokers. We basically pick some safe invokers initially, and we say we might remove that whitelist or expand it in future forks. But basically this general question remains: how can we in advance make sure that only invokers that follow patterns we think actually basically are forward compatible for account abstraction are adopted? And yeah, it's not obvious.
Thanks. Rafi, you were the next one. Then we can.
Yeah,
move
I
to
was
the
about
next
to ask almost the same exact question. So like, I think instead of like discussing, like first, instead of discussing the censorship and the others, we do need to understand the actual motivation here, because if you're just throwing the 3074 without the actual plan to then migrate to 4337, then we are just basically creating two divergent stacks that are competing, as I said. So yeah. Okay.
All right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
go
the
ahead.
biggest, so I'm sorry, I just thought that I heard something. So the biggest question here is actually, I think, like, instead of thinking how 3074 can basically bring how the apps are like going to be more willing to support account abstraction features, I think first instead the discussion should be made around the motivation and also the situation that how 3074 will be migrating to 4337 in the future, at least in the foreseeable future.
All right. Ahmad, last one, and then we move to the alternatives.
Right. So first of all, I would want to point out that I'm like, I was one of the supporters of 3074's Scalam. And the fact is, account abstraction is the end game here, and we want account abstraction to be like smart accounts to be the de facto account for everyone on the blockchain. But the road to that seems to take a very long time, and for us to just wait until that is sorted in years to come does not look like the UX. And we're like, the users of the blockchain of L1 are always saying that they feel that the core devs and the developers of the blockchain are not putting the user as the first class citizen and not thinking about the user experience that the user has to put up with to transact on whether it's Ethereum L1 or L2s. And with that in mind, I don't think just hindering EOAs is the correct approach to resolving like force migrating users into smart accounts. Because if they if we just say, okay, let's not allow EOAs to feel a little bit better to the users just so smart accounts can flourish, well, then why didn't smart accounts already flourish by now? They had all of these years of advantage supposedly in the UX department, but adoption is still stagnant, as we can see. The other thing is restricting the invoker contract to a predefined list. Like, since when do protocol researchers and core devs decide on like why are we trying to block innovation in this area? Like the same thing that applies to the invokers applies to smart accounts. To interface with a smart account, you need to have an to work with a smart account and publish your transactions through a smart account. You need to have currently, you need to have a lot of infrastructure built. You need to have a UI built to support the smart account, etc., etc. If you're not following a standard smart account, you will have a really, really hard time getting your transactions in. So it's normal that a certain invoker implementation would have a certain interface. Let's say every wallet needs to support a certain invoker. They can develop the invoker that supports their UI, etc. And this is the same thing that already smart contracts already have. So like this is not different than smart accounts. It's exactly the same. And saying that invoker contracts and the wallets blocking, like having some kind of control over which invoker contracts they would allow or disallow does not make any sense, because that's exactly the same for smart accounts as well, in my opinion.
All right. We will let Yoav respond, then we really need to move forward, else the call is going to be very long. So Yoav, you have your response.
Yeah, so I'll keep it short so we can move on. Just wanted to make a comment that we also think, I mean, me and the counter-struction team, we also see EOA improvements as important, and I think we should have something. The difference here is that with invokers, I mean, we want to allow any form of innovation, but we also want to be able to decentralize and to have censorship resistance, if not now, then at least in the future. And this requires separating validation and execution. That's a key part of anything that would use a permissionless mempool, because otherwise denial of service attacks become too powerful. So with invokers, the way 3074 does them, it is much harder because this separation does not exist. So yes, it allows you to innovate. It allows you to innovate on the EOA improvements, but unless you do them in a very specific way, such as implementing the invoker as a 4337 account, then you will not be able. We will not be able to have censorship resistance later, because it's not something that you can fix later. Whereas if it's a transaction type, and I don't mind which one, like for example, the one that Vitalik just proposed seems like a good alternative. If you have the functionality of 3074, but implemented as a transaction type with the separation between validation and execution, then you can have all of the same innovation at 3074, but also be able to have a permissionless mempool. And I think that's the key point I would make about that.
Perfect. Thanks. That makes a great transition. So we have a new proposal. It's 7702, very new. So maybe Vitalik, if you want to give us a quick explanation here.
So I just pasted the link into the chat in case anyone wants to follow along. So the idea of 7702 is basically to have something that you can think of it as having the form factor of 5806, but the user and dev experience that's very similar to 3074. And the basic idea is that what we do is we create a new transaction type, where that transaction type allows a user to provide a contract code and then sign over that contract code. And then that signature gets included into the transaction. You can even have multiple included into a transaction. And then for the scope of that transaction, the user's code gets replaced with that piece of contract code. And the way that this would work in order to mirror 3074 use cases is basically that you would have a transaction, and then the sender of that transaction could, or the origin could possibly be some account other than the user, and the user would just sign over their code. And then for the scope of that transaction, the user's EOA code will be replaced with contract code. And then instead of having calls, or instead of doing an auth to authenticate the account and then an off call to call on the account's behalf, you would basically just literally do two calls into the user's wallet that would verify, perform some other form of verification, and immediately after that, just call into the wallet and then do whatever execution that they wanted to do. So basically, so this approach is nice because it's both very clear how existing 3074 use cases can be translated to it. And at the same time, it has this really nice property of forward compatibility with the smart contract wallet ecosystem, because essentially the code that a user would sign over would just need to be a smart contract wallet code. And it would even work as is if a user signs over their existing 4337 wallets. And so it basically accomplishes the same functionality as 3074 in the sense of allowing a wallet to temporarily turn into a smart contract for the scope of one transaction. And at the same time, it would also enable all of the standard use cases, including batching, including more complicated forms of batching, including sponsorship, including privilege de-escalation, and potentially, you could even just have it or have the transaction just be an ERC 4337 bundle that directly calls into an entry point. And so it's it's very compatible with the existing 3074 ecosystem, and at the same time, it's very forward compatible with both the 4337 ecosystem, but also theoretically pretty much any kind of pathway towards smart contract wallets, right? So there is nothing 4337 opinionated about this proposal, in the sense that the only opinion that it has is the idea that you have some kind of smart contract wallet that you're activating for one transaction, right? And so if some smart contract wallet proposal that looks very different from 4337 ends up winning, then this would also be forward compatible with that as well. So that's the core idea. Basically, becoming a smart contract wallet for one transaction and doing that as a transaction type. I guess right. And I mean, the basic goal of this, I think, is that there have been multiple efforts at coming up with things that provide some of the use cases of through 3074, but without the properties of 3074 that people have the most issue with. But this one, I think, goes much further in terms of providing pretty much I believe basically all of the 3074 use cases, because there's just such a nice way to translate existing off and off call workflows. Let's see, going through some questions. Can 7702 be used together with 4337 and bundle user ops from multiple accounts? The answer is yes. So you can authorize you can have multiple contract codes for multiple accounts to get authorized. And so you can basically literally have a single transaction that just is a 4337 bundle where the code is all exactly the same as it is today, except if you want to make it work with some EOAs, you would just do it inside this new transaction type, and you would put their the signed contract codes in, and it would basically just work as is. Then I mean, there's questions around should you sign over a nonce? Should you sign over a chain ID? How reusable do we want this? And I mean, I personally am agnostic to this, and I think we can probably borrow a lot of the discussion that we've had around 3074 and 5806, and pretty strongly the or a lot of the reasoning should be pretty similar. Why, right? Signing the code versus signing the code address is one of those interesting points. I think. Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things that I personally think doesn't really matter much in either direction. Basically because if you sign a code address, then or like you can sign any code by just publishing it first, and then if you don't have code addresses, then with I think it's EIP 1167 or ERC 1167 proxy is like a proxy that wraps around an existing piece of code is only a few extra bytes.
Sorry,
then,
in
yeah.
7702, how is the code getting on chain if you sign over the code? Do you have to propagate it every time?
Yes, you do. So in the code proposal, you do have to propagate the code every time. And the argument for why this is like not incredibly inefficient and fatal is basically because we expect users in practice to just use proxies for this. And proxies actually
Right.
can be extremely small. Like the one I mentioned is only 44 bytes.
Makes sense.
We have a yes, Daniel.
Mm.
You can unmute.
Yeah, just one question. How do you prevent that the users are signing some malicious contract with this type of transactions? Because wouldn't you end up that wallets have to have sort of a whitelist again, but in this case just for contract code?
Yes, good question. So I think the set of concerns around like that people raised with 3074 of like complaining about having to trust invokers, like a lot, this does not solve a lot of the concerns, and like the need to trust code does remain. But that's something that exists in any smart contract wallet ecosystem, right? Like that also exists or like a version of it exists in 4337 because like ultimately a user has to trust whatever wallet implementation they use. And so I think the recommended way to interface with this would basically be that your wallet would have a canonical smart contract implementation that follows some particular API, and that's pretty much the only thing that you would trust.
Yeah, but then in the end, I mean, this would be the same concerns as with 3074. No, I mean, there would not be any improvement. It would just be instead of the invokers, you trust the smart contract that the wallet allows.
Right. I mean, maybe the one thing you can say is that it's more plausible that a user would be able to have only one and be done with it. But you know.
Okay.
All right. Next question, Derek.
So I do have like a lot of questions. I guess I'll just like ask three questions right now. So one is it's not clear to me from the EIP, and I really only had like maybe 5 minutes to read it like before the call. So it's not clear to me from the EIP like how does storage work, right? Because most of like the most important use cases of AA depends on storage, right? So I would like to learn more about how storage works in this case. The second question is it's not super clear to me why Vitalik, you decided that it's better to sign over the codes of the contracts instead of just signing the address of an existing contract, right? So that's the second question. And then the third question is it's also not clear to me why just like how does this proposal handle expiration, right? So like what is like the lifetime of the authorization? Yeah, so those would be my three questions. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think on the first one, there's basically two approaches. One is to just allow storage, and the other is to either like force storage to be temporary or even just disallow storing completely in the way that 5806 does. And the trade-off is basically that if you allow adding storage, then there's well, I think in 5806 it might have been actually a bigger risk because the implication in 5806 would be that users would be more often in the habit of constantly newly signing over pieces of code, whereas here, like a realistic user might have one, but like there's the risk that if you sign the wrong thing, that your storage gets screwed up, and then if you want to like actually deploy a contract safely, then like you'd have to like do some other, like sign over some other piece of code that clears over all your storage or something like that. And then the other option is you just disallow a store. And if you disallow a store, then realistically, yeah, like you'd have to rely on storage that's stored somewhere else, or you'd possibly have to just make do without storage and rely exclusively on like protocol level nonsense for replay protection. So those are the two paths that I see. For the like signing over contract code instead of signing over addresses thing, I mean, I think, as I've said before, like I'm personally not too opinionated. I'm okay with either approach, and like I actually don't think that the two approaches are that different from each other in terms of their consequences. And what was the third question again?
The third
expiration?
Yeah.
Oh, expiration, yes. So I think, I mean, the most natural expiration strategy is basically to stick the nonce into the thing that gets signed, right? Or at least make it an option. So that's like, if we want the ability to expire, that's probably the easiest way to do it. Then I saw another question, like, would it increase gas usage because EOA users would provide code in every transaction? And right, I think the answer there is basically that either if you use an ERC 1167 proxy as your code, then your code is just 44 bytes, and 44 bytes is like very trivial call data cost wise. Or if we do it as by providing code addresses instead of code, then that problem also solves usage in a different way.
All right, Eric, next.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask about the practicality of implementing this in Pectra. I think from what I understand, given the similarity to 3074, I kind of get the sense from people that it should be possible, but at least from my end, this is kind of a core question because of the importance of including those capabilities before we go into the Verkle tree, basically pause in things that could improve user experience.
Sure. I think it makes sense for core dev to reply to that question. So
that would have to be discussed on the call. I don't think a single core dev could give a yes or no to it.
All right. The next question, Ahmad.
Yeah. So my question is that, so I have kind of a couple. One question is, like, if you have to sign a contract code or address with every transaction, how would you be able? So like 3074 allows you to auth a contract, and this auth is valid on you can put certain permissions on this auth that it would execute at any time. So how would 7702 do the same thing? That's one thing. And the second question is, from the core development perspective, like one of the motivations behind 7702 is that we don't want to introduce two new opcodes into the EVM, the auth and auth call, but instead we're introducing a new transaction type that could possibly be deprecated. So from a core development perspective, is a new transaction type really less of a big deal than just adding the two opcodes? The third and last would be, how would 7702 be different than that proposal that Light Client created, where he said that we can modify 3074 to make the frame of execution is the EOA itself and point to the invoker contract. That way, the invoker contract can kind of act like a smart account. Inside the execution frame will be the EOA address, but it will act exactly like a smart contract account.
For the opcode versus transaction type, maybe a core dev can answer, or I mean, someone with the knowledge about this.
I was asking Vitalik about this because
Yeah.
I am
All right.
recorded.
Yeah, I mean, I think my case for why transaction types are like lighter than or more like less of a technical debt problem, I guess, than opcodes is that, like, in principle, if you remove a transaction type eventually, then or the only infrastructure that would have to change in response to that is off-chain infrastructure. Whereas if you remove an opcode eventually, then that would require on-chain infrastructure, including smart contracts that people were counting on to be at the same place and have the same functionality forever to change how they work. And so, like, the second is just strictly harder than the first. And like we've seen how challenging it is even with self-destruct, which is an opcode that barely anyone uses at all. And this is an opcode that's or a transaction type that's likely to become part of very mainstream user workflows. So that would be my probably my case for why opcode for why a transaction type makes more sense in this case. And then, I mean, I guess there's also the philosophical point that like opcodes feel like something that should focus more on computational things, and like basically there's value in this like very high level user authorization stuff being something that's being something that's at the transaction type level because it's more legible to the protocol and might be more forward compatible with various things.
Right, and around the question of how would 7702 support use cases like an auth that has other use cases than the immediate transaction, like where you auth a contract and this contract would be then called under certain permissions at any time?
I mean, in principle, you should be able to do it, right? Because basically, you would just send out that auth, and that auth would just be a piece of contract code, and then you'd be able to call into it from like whatever from some other contract, and like basically a very parallel way to how an implementation through that uses 3074 would be able to call the auth opcode. Right, because like what you're basically doing is you're basically saying you replace the auth with a call into the contract. That you can replace the auth call with another call into the contract, or maybe you can replace both with one. So in principle, they like any use case should be able to just like be translated at the very least by translating it naively.
Yeah, I think so, but it does feel a little bit more restrictive than how auth and auth call operate. I'm not entirely sure.
All right.
Right. I mean, one other way, just I think to finish that thought, one other way to address that type of question might be to explore how the 4337 ecosystem has approached that particular use case, because there's some chance that it has, and you'd be able to convert the 4337 approach into working with this EIP as well.
So like the question is because like the smart contract code is only valid for the duration of the transaction. So what 4337 has is that they have the smart contract code always live on mainnet, whereas
right. So
yeah.
Right. So in this case, the solution would be that like it could be reusable, right? Like basically, I think this all has to do with like, do you sign over the nonce or do you not sign over the nonce? And actually, even if you do sign over the nonce, if you sign over the nonce but you don't update the nonce, then it's still something that becomes reusable.
Yeah, makes sense.
Derek, go ahead.
Oh yeah, so personally, like after thinking about the proposal more, I definitely think that it's a more elegant and more clean way to do to kind of like bring the benefits of AA to EOA, right, and like I also like how it's more forward compatible with the overall AA roadmap. But I think like from a practical standpoint of adopting 7702 in Pectra, I think it does have a few more dependencies compared to 3074, right? So right now 3074 is already implemented by the client teams. So if we want to ship 7702 within roughly the same time frame as the original time for 3074, then I think there are two main dependencies, right? So one is that I'd like to hear from the core devs, like whether they think that implementing this new transaction type is doable within the time frame of within time frame of Pectra. And secondly, since this proposal will require, I think like if we want to use the 7702 with the 437 mempool, which I think is like how most people want to use it, then it will also require an update in the specs of 437 itself, as well as like the updates of all the bundle infrastructure, right? So I think I would like to also hear from the AA team whether they are roughly on board with this proposal, and whether they think that they're like kind of like like the bundlers can also implement support for this proposal within a reasonable time frame. Yeah.
Great question. I think Light Client gave a reply in the chat, which is yes for the first part. And for the second part, I would invite AA teams to discuss it.
So what specifically what part do you want to discuss?
Oh, so the question is basically just because it's like to use 3074, so like 3074 comparing to this new proposal has the advantage that like it can basically leverage the 437 mempool in a way that doesn't require any modification to 437, right? Like through a multi-tenant invoker account. So I like this new proposal, but it does require updates to 437 itself, as well as obviously updates to bundlers. So I guess like my question is just like, have you guys had the time to review this proposal? And are you guys roughly aligned with this proposal? And like, would you get behind this proposal and update 437 if this proposal was adopted?
I think in general, the proposal looks good, but since it was written like an hour before this call, I think we'll need to think about it a bit, see how it fits in the 4337, how it fits in the framework in a way that doesn't create new attack vectors. But yeah, if it's so if this proposal does not introduce any problems, if we have a good way of integrating it, then I don't see why we wouldn't. But again, we can't commit to it before spending some time thinking about it because it's very new.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, because to me, like if both the core devs team and the 4337 team can get behind this proposal, then I really think that this is that this is like the best way forward. Yeah.
I tend to agree. I tend to agree. I think it could be a good way forward, but I think we just probably need at least a few days to think about this proposal because it's so new, and see if it's if we can't see any new problems it creates, which on the face of it I don't see, then then it would be.
Yeah, but I also do want to say that's like I think it's important for us to commit to get this into Pectra, just because like I think like since like 3074 itself has already been delayed for years, I think we really shouldn't just like keep kicking the can down the road. So it's like if we want to replace 3074 with this proposal, then I think like we really should have like a strong commitment from both the core devs and 437 team to ship this within the Pectra timeframe. Yeah.
Sure.
So
that's
we haven't. we haven't had time to even discuss it. So I'm only speaking for myself here. I think we'll need to. I think the team will need to discuss it, and we'll probably need to discuss it on the Mafia group. But yeah, I think we should do it and the sooner the better, so it can be included in Pectra.
Perfect. Thanks for the reply. Elim, you had your hands up.
Yeah. Hello. So I think remember from one of the previous all core devs, I think Vitalik mentioned that like a reasoning for not including like an EIP such as I think 5003 or 7377 was that it breaks an invariant that EOAs don't have a contract or don't have code. So I guess if that still holds, then like does 7702 kind of also touch on breaking this invariant? And if so, then what's the reasoning for having this kind of temporary code solution rather than just outright like including something like 5003 or 7377 that permanently migrates the account?
Yeah. So I think so. In terms of my previous comments on like the breaking the code invariant, like just one thing to be clear is like I am in favor of breaking that invariant, right? I'm just in favor of us being super explicit about it so that applications such as NFTs that depend on non-transferability and things like that are aware that the changes are going to happen well ahead of time, and people don't make new applications that depend on it and then get hit by a surprise later. One other interesting, really nice thing about 772 that I didn't mention yet is that like 5003 is like literally just one line of code on top, right? Basically, yeah, like you could imagine a flag being added where if the flag is set at the end of the transaction, you just don't revert the code back to 0, right? And if we do that, then 5003 basically exists immediately. And from a code complexity perspective, it feels like the delta between doing that and not doing that is like fairly small. I think the only reason why I didn't want to just include it into the EIP by default is just because like I didn't want to introduce this as something that like changes like 10 different potentially controversial things all at once. But like if we decide that we want 5003 to happen fast, then we do have a very easy way to do that, either in Pectra or in a future fork.
I guess like kind of maybe I just wasn't that clear, or maybe I just didn't understand quite. But like, what is the reasoning for not just doing that end game, like end game migration?
Oh, so for like not just like adding the flag to set the code permanently in the initial version. I mean,
yeah.
I personally am not against it. I just like procedurally, I just wanted to present this as an alternative way of satisfying 3074's use cases without also simultaneously doing the discussion of like let's do 5003 in Pectra. But if people decide that they want them simultaneously, then like I have zero opposition to that personally.
Thanks. Light Client, maybe you have something to add, because we had some points on the agenda that were related to some of the things we just said, but maybe you want to take them in the 3074 context.
Sorry, go ahead, Ben.
Just regarding permanently writing code to the EOA, wouldn't that mean you can essentially brick your wallet? Which should be a very bad outcome by writing the wrong code. There's no walking back from it.
I mean, yes, it does. Yeah, and like that's the reason why things like 5003 have any controversy at all.
Right. I mean, it's the same problem with smart contract wallets too. So if we're moving to a world where everyone's going to have a smart contract wallet, then we're going to have the possibility of them setting the proxy of their smart contract wallet to the 0 address and never getting their funds back out. So it's something that we need to design for. Yeah, I mean, in terms of 3074, I think we're sort of up in the air at this point. Like, I'm happy to discuss some of these things, but given that there seems to be pretty good support for 7702, you know, we're still working on 3074. It is going to go into the initial DevNet for Pectra, but I am personally open to removing it and swapping something different in. 7702 seems like a good alternative. I want to spend some more time looking at it, maybe iterating a little bit on the design, but in general, I'm happy with it. We need to wait to see if it's acceptable by the 4337 team, because if it doesn't support the decentralized permissionless relaying use case, then I think that it doesn't really give us what we're looking for in this upgrade. Does anyone have any 3074 specific things that they were hoping to discuss?
Yoshiari?
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
This is a little skeptical point of view regarding EIP 7702. Is that it could be a threat to EIP ERC 4337 account exception, because EOA have options to update their code. Why would they shift to a smart account later on? Am I making sense?
No, I think that it makes sense. So the thing that I would say is basically that like if 7702 gets introduced, then you as a user would absolutely be able to just like keep on using EIP 7702 transaction types either forever or until the transaction. If the transaction type gets removed 10 years in the future, then you know, you would actually have to upgrade. But the main reason you would have to like actually finalize the upgrading eventually would basically be if you want to switch keys and if you want your original EOA key to no longer have full powers over the account anymore. So I think the case for it being a bridge is basically that if you, like any user who is in that halfway house state of being a frequent 7702 user would actually be part of the 4337 ecosystem, and they would share networks with the 4337 ecosystem. And once the ability to permanently set code is introduced, then they would have the ability to just switch over to being a full member of that ecosystem anytime, and they would not have to. So I think in practice, it's not a competitor to the 4337 world. I think it ends up serving as a bridge. But
Alexander, you want to say something? Nope. All right.
I guess one thing on the agenda under the 3074 category, but that's also relevant to this discussion on 7702, is there has been a lot of debate about like how flexible should this signature be, and we've discussed it a bit in passing in this call, but I maybe can just ask if people want to make arguments for or against the signature having certain fields that limit its flexibility. For instance, the chain ID or the nonce that exists in the signature. Right now, as it's written, 7702 does not have the chain ID or nonce. It's a question of should we add those things to it? I have personally felt that they're not necessary because the contract should enforce that functionality, but I'm open to feedback from others.
Yes, first hand raised was Ansgar, I think.
Yeah, so I will say, because I'm also I would, otherwise I would have also argued on this call for removing those restrictions from 3074. I think, given that all of these proposals come with a requirement for manual wallet whitelisting anyway, basically, like, all of these restrictions can be enforced to an equivalent level through that process. So you can have the exact same restrictions around revocability, around expiry, around chain ID binding, just basically by wallets only ever whitelisting invokers, or in this case code that actually brings those restrictions. But the nice thing is, now it's up to that ERC layer, and so if at some point some pattern emerges that requires those not to be present, we can just upgrade to them. And so I would always argue that we should do this. The security model is already that we trust that the wallet does not do anything stupid with the whitelisting. So there really is no downside to this, other than maybe it would set the wrong standard in the ecosystem. But to me, basically, the added flexibility always outweighs those concerns.
Ahmed?
Yeah, I actually agree with Ansgar on this front. The protocol does not need to really restrict to enforce these restrictions. Usually, we as pointed previously in one of the previous calls by Light Client, we usually let these type of restrictions happen on the smart contract kind of side of things, and we don't have enforcement on the protocol side of things. And because this is a new transaction type, like wallets will not as soon as Pictra lands, wallets are going to become vulnerable to this attack. No, they have to like support and whitelist or do the work needed to support this transaction type. And as such, the risk of, suddenly after the fork, all the users are vulnerable to some kind of scam does not really apply in this case, because again, like support from the wallet side of things needs to be added because of the new transaction type.
Fair point. Richard?
I'm also more on the side of not enforcing nonce and chain ID, why I do see many points made about security. There's for me also the distinction, do we need to make them required or can they be optional, right? Like, can we leave it up to dApps users, the wallets to like give this option? Because if we also make it optional, we see that there's a landscape of more and more networks coming in. And if we say we make them optional, actually there are certain use cases where having replayability across chains is super powerful, right? Like, it's like there are two sides of the same coin, right? Like, so replayability can be bad and good. And generally, just excluding it will limit our design space, which I think currently we are in the need for better UX. We need to have a bigger design space, not a smaller one. And I mean, the only point that comes to my mind why we should enforce them is because apparently it's easier to get this through with certain stakeholders in the Ethereum ecosystem. I'm not sure if this is the best reason.
Yep, Jor, you can go ahead.
Yes. Okay, I'm trying to think about what Richard said, because my first inclination was just like with 3074, these are required to avoid long-lived signatures and network malleability. Whether they can be optional, I'm not sure. So I'm not thinking about it. Try not to speculate it right now. And earlier it was how is it fit with the 4327? Again, we've seen it only for 1 hour when we didn't really look deep, but it looks like it's promising. It might allow EOAs to become first-class citizen in a transaction and in the 4327 transaction. And looking forward, like account abstracted transaction. So it looks promising, but again, we didn't really look at the code, how it will change anything, either the entry point, maybe the entry point doesn't change at all, or the bundles. Need to check.
Sure. we might want to plan out another breakout room, given the fact that 7702 is so young. But we will discuss this later. Ben, you can go ahead.
If the things like chain ID and so forth aren't included in the signature, then that would lean more towards it being contract code than a contract address in the signing, because then you could include the chain ID in that optionally, if that makes sense. Whereas if it was just a contract address, you wouldn't be able to include that. You'd have to include it in the data, which would be a different signature.
Yep, good point. Rick, you want to go?
So yeah, I just want to jump in quickly. So I mean, first of all, I feel like one thing we could always do is make it so chain ID 0 is the like, omni chain if you wanted to like disable. So you're done talking. Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, so if you wanted to disable like the ability to work on just a specific chain, but for me personally, like when I'm signing my ledger, if it's on a network that I don't really care about, then when it pops up saying you're signing this for Arbitrum, I'm far more willing to click a button. Like recently, I've noticed a lot more things are signing weird type messages that don't specify the chain ID. It's kind of scary because you don't know, are you like authorizing like DAI on whatever network? So tying it down to one network definitely like reduces the threat profile of what I'm worried about. So it could be a wallet limitation currently, but that's kind of my quick reasons for wanting chain ID kind of embedded in it. Again, with the option to disable that by setting the chain ID to 0.
Yep, interesting point. I do agree. I do tend to sign things much faster when it's on a layer 2 network. Who's next? We have a lot of hands raised. David, maybe?
Yeah, this is not directly tied with like the chain ID and the nonce within the signature, but I see one of the things that the community discussed regarding 3074 is like the original key still being used. So like there isn't that validation execution, but rather execution abstraction. And I also see, correct me if I'm wrong, on the 7702 that the account is still bound to the original key. And I wanted to discuss with the community, like, what if we could, the current architecture uses the EC recover from the protocol, but will there be a chance where we could create like add another parameter where we add the input or the address of the validator contract, which is similar to having like so basically to support like custom signature scheme with 7702. So we delegate the validation to another parameter, which a custom smart contract will handle, rather than like being bound to like the default protocol. Although I understand the point, I just wanted to bring this up and see like what the community thinks about this.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, it depends on this philosophical question of whether you're looking at the 7702 workflow as being this kind of like temporary thing that like, you know, the equivalent of like a Linux live USB install where you can just like plug the USB stick in your laptop and then it like loads up Ubuntu without ever installing it. And that just gives a nice way for users to like quickly try the functionality versus if you're looking at like swapping the code for the scope of one transaction as being a workflow that sticks around long term, even after users switch to smart contract wallets. And I think when writing this, my thinking was much more the first, but and then like basically because I think the second could be covered by smart contracts themselves having the functionality to authorize like new pieces of code for temporary scopes. But I mean, I'm definitely open to thinking about it the other way.
Derek, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, so personally, like I don't have like a very strong opinion on chain IDs, but I do want to say that like about nonce, I think like whether it's with 7702 or 3074, I think it's like if our benefit, like if our goal is to bring the benefits of account abstraction to users, then I think it's very, very important that we avoid including nonce in the signature. The reason is because like, so it's like, you know, like our company Zero Dev, like we have been working very closely with like many of the early adopters of account abstraction, right? So like all the most popular use cases of AA, besides maybe like guest sponsoring, depends on long-standing, long-lived authorizations, right? You know, so for example, like two of like the most powerful use cases of AA, like one is like attaching alternative signing methods to your smart accounts, such as like passkeys, right? You know, so like imagining attaching a passkey to your EOA through either 3074 or 7702, right? So in that case, because you want to keep using that signer, the fact that like every single transaction from your EOA will invalidate that signer will make that use case basically impossible, right? And then like another use case is like session keys, like the idea of essentially delegating transactions for other devs to execute. Like that's also like a really powerful and popular use case. And again, like that wouldn't be possible if like the authorizations can just be invalidated like all the time, right? So I think it's like very important that we avoid the pitfall of including nonce into the signature, which will essentially make some of like the most popular AA use cases we have seen impossible. Yeah, so that's my take.
Thanks for the contribution. Partha, you want to add something?
Yeah. Sorry, this may sound a bit naive. I'm trying to understand a bit more on 7702. I mean, for the execution context, the account in this case would function as a smart account, right? So does it mean you would need support for 1271 or a variant 6492? Or would dApps continue to support or treat these requests emanating from the EOA as a regular EOA-based transaction? Did that make sense?
That does, and that's an interesting point. I mean, there's basically two ways to handle that, right? One is basically that you just say, well, for 1271, it keeps on being an EOA. The other way to do it is you basically do a 6492 extension that basically says, if the user provides an authorized piece of code, then like that gets treated as a 1271 signature, exactly the same way, like in a way that's very parallel to what happens in 6492. So I guess either of those make sense. I mean, the second obviously takes more work because it's in ERC, but the second is more powerful because off-chain signatures are often precisely one of the things that you care about, like creating lower security, higher accessibility, deprivileged keys for.
Thanks.
Dror, if you want to go ahead.
Yes, Derek mentioned that the reasons why I don't like the nonce in the signature because it limits the signature, and we have exactly the same issue as with 3074. I'm all for it as long as you keep some mechanism to allow the user to revoke a signature that was already published on chain. Otherwise, you sign for life for a specific implementation, which I don't think is a good idea.
Yep, good point. You have.
Yeah, so regarding the nonce, I mean, first of all, I do think that being able to revoke and fix your past mistakes, so to speak, is important, but it doesn't have to limit any use case. So I would propose instead of including nonce, include a max nonce. Just you can include a max nonce. Say this is valid for the next maybe 1 million nonces or whatever, which gives you like infinite, gives you since you are not going to have 1 million transactions, it gives you a infinite approval, but also have a way to bump the nonce by a 32-bit value. So, and the rationale for that is that if you realize that you need to revoke your past signatures, now you can bump the nonce by let's say 1,000,001, and be sure that your past authorizations are no longer valid. And on the other hand, it doesn't put the replay protection at risk, because the 32-bit value where the nonce is 64 still gives you more than enough room not to ever overlap. So I think that using a max nonce and a way to bump the nonce would give us like both things, infinite authorization and being able to revoke. Would that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating idea. I think one weakness that's worth pointing out is that it does weaken the mempool's ability to safely queue up multiple transactions for a user, because right now, if a user queues up 50 transactions, all 50 would have to be included. But with nonce-bumping, you lose that guarantee. But then at the same time, like, we realistically lose that guarantee for account abstraction anyway. And you can argue that once you have batching, there's not actually as much of a point in having that guarantee anymore. So, like, I personally don't see that as fatal. Just want to flag that regression does exist.
I think it doesn't. This doesn't create a regression, because this is already possible today. I mean, we can have currently the mempool allows you to have, if I recall correctly, 63. I mean, the default configuration in Geth is 63 pending transactions, but the current transaction actually can. So it can invalidate the other transactions by draining the account, sending it elsewhere.
Well,
so
right, no, but what you can do though is that you can do a check that checks if the user's balance is greater or equal to the sum of the values of all of the transactions, and then you can forward conditional on that.
Yeah, you can do that. So it does. So bumping. But what I would do is, since bumping the nonce is an extreme case, it's not something that you do all the time. You're going to do it if you think you need to invalidate all your past authorizations. So I would say that this should cost a lot of gas, which means that it cannot be used for denial of service. I think it's fine. It's fine if you pay if you pay some really high amount of gas for this one-time invalidation of past authorizations.
Yeah, that's a cool idea.
Conrad, you want to go?
Yeah, sure. Kind of just wanted to weigh in on the nonce debate. I think my 2 cents here are obviously there's some good points on both sides. Like, I would probably err on the side of kind of not enforcing kind of nonce or chain ID checks like on the protocol, like unless we actually have to. And kind of like, I think from the points made before, I think it would be a nice to have, but it would be something that could be equally solved kind of using an ERC or kind of like just in general kind of application level, like standards or just like implementations. And I think like one argument there that I don't think has been mentioned before is if we assume that wallets will to some extent whitelist these kind of like either invokers on 3074 or kind of like smart accounts, then wallets might as well kind of check that there's some way of revoking kind of like outstanding signatures. So I think that's another argument for being able to rely on like application level like standards or just like the implementations to have like revocability or like cross-chain kind of like preventing cross-chain replayability if that's like required in certain use cases.
Just on the nonce invalidating transactions, that door's already been opened by being able to run code in your account because it can move all the ETH out. So the first transaction could invalidate the rest by not having any more gas.
All right. I think we have covered a lot of the topics that were planned for today, even though we spent a lot of time on the new alternatives. I think it could probably be good to plan another breakout, considering the fact that 7702 is so young and many teams will need to look at it. So let me know what you think, guys, but I think we are signing up for another round.
Great. Thanks so much, Nico, for helping moderate this discussion. I think we'll discuss this further on All Core Devs also, which is Thursday at the same time as this call. I can add 7702 to the agenda if anybody wants to come and hear what the client teams have to say, or maybe like share your perspective, you're welcome to. But otherwise, we'll see everybody in the AA Mafia Telegram.
Yeah, absolutely. And last point, I think exactly as Ansgar said, it's quite good to see all this energy around the AA roadmap. So let's continue with this energy moving forward. Thank you, everyone. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.